Right, welcome everybody. I'm chair of Wild Anglia, which is our local nature partnership, which has had an interesting and rocky ride in its formation. The government announced them about 3 or 4 years ago and told everybody to go out and form local nature partnerships, and actually there's 48 of them, which are more than local economic partnerships. But of course, what DEFRA said was, we've got no money, no resources, nothing, just go and do it. So that's what we've done. So it's been a bit of a trial, keeping us going. But luckily, due to some sponsorship, we've now been able to launch Wild Words, which is fantastic. So this is great for this debate. Hopefully, we're going to discuss for about an hour. And if it goes on a little bit longer, it can do. But I'll keep us to reasonably to time. But we will fulfil and close at 7:30 at absolutely the latest. The last one went on to at least 7:20, depending on how much you want to say. If you say nothing, we might be out here by 6:30. So it's down to you guys to join in and to make that debate. This isn't our debate, it's yours, as it were. It's a discussion about health and well-being and nature. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Barbara Young, Baroness Barbara Young. Barbara, I first met Barbara when she became Chief Exec of the RSPB. Back in the middle 90s, I think, at that time, but we won't go there. Before that, she was Chief Executive of one of the biggest health trusts in London, comes from a sort of health background, came into conservation in a big way. I have to say, she was one of the most, I have to say this, don't I, but it's true. She was one of the most inspiring bosses I've ever had. Very hard work, very gave you a lot of hard work to do, but incredibly inspiring. And we wouldn't have done as much as we did in the RSPB in my time, had it not been for Barbara and Graham Wynne after Barbara. After that, she became chair of English Nature and chief executive of the Environment Agency, and now chief executive of Diabetes UK, and soon to be, am I allowed to say? And soon to be now chair of the Woodland Trust, so coming back into conservation in a big way. So that's great news for the Woodland Trust, without a doubt. So without further ado, I'll hand over to, I couldn't think of anybody better to come and talk to us about health and well-being in nature, so I'll hand over to Baroness Barbara Young.
I don't think there are any doubts about the evidence base for a good environment being good for health. I mean, for the last 10 to 15 years, people have been amassing the evidence, and it's just indubitable. I mean, clean air, clean water, unpolluted soils have a huge and direct impact on health. And if you think about, what prompted some of the biggest environmental legislation in the 1950s was London smogs, the Clean Air Act, all of that stuff. But more recently, the evidence has been emerging and being developed for health and well-being benefits of the natural environment. For example, the Natural Ecosystem Assessment found that observing nature and participating in physical activity in green spaces positively influenced human health and well-being. And exercise in green places is associated with positive health outcomes, and strangely enough, are actually more positive than exercising in non-green spaces. So, a press-up in the park is better than a press-up in the gym. Natural England, of course, ran their big project on Walking the Way to Health, and they found that they could demonstrate savings to the NHS of £7 billion. It also found, the report also found that people are 24% more likely to be physically active if they've got access to green space. So I think that access word is really important. And if we want to talk about kids, there's an American study that showed that kids who live close to green space have got higher levels of physical activity and lower body mass indices. And so the kind of modern challenge in health is not about gross impacts of pollution and contamination as they were in the 50s. They're about lifestyle. And the one I know best, of course, is type 2 diabetes, but it's a kind of indicator for a whole range of health conditions. When I first went to Diabetes UK 5 years ago, I must admit I was smacked of the gob in a big way. Because the reality is, it was the best kept secret in the universe, and most people in the health system didn't know that type 2 diabetes was as big and serious and growing and expensive, but ultimately fixable in a very easy way. And let me just give you some of the stats that really shook me rigid. 4 million people now with type 2 diabetes. 7 million people beyond that at high risk. And that means probably going to develop diabetes in the next 10 years. Now costing 10% of the NHS budget. That's 10 billion quid a year. And yet, we know from the research evidence that 20 minutes brisk walking every day and losing 8% of your body weight can absolutely remove your risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and can reverse the symptoms. And it's not about heroic exercise. It's not, cycles and lycra. It's about a bit of a brisk walk. And it's not just about the calories, the extra calories that you consume, as it were, in having that exercise. There's also an added metabolic effect that enhances the amount of risk reduction for diabetes. And of course, diabetes is massive, and at long last governments recognise that. But it's also the single major cause of heart disease, stroke, renal failure, amputation, blindness. So if you sort diabetes, you sort an awful lot of current health issues. And all that for 20 minutes walk and 8% of your body weight reduction, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. So why does it not happen? And it's not just physical health, of course. The Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health found that regular exercise in a natural environment, and not just regular exercise, but regular exercise in a natural environment, can cut the risk of poor mental health by 50%. And of course, there are a fair number of us in this room who at some stage in our life will suffer from poor mental health. 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 10 children between the ages of 5 and 16. And that's pretty huge. That is pretty huge. So there's all to go for. This is not something that's just nice to have. This is something that's absolutely fundamental to achieve. And the studies in terms of mental health show that not just access, but also participation in green spaces reduces anxiety, depression, loneliness, improves concentration and mood. There's a Cochrane study. Cochrane is one of these kind of processes where you gather all the evidence from everywhere and then try to work out whether the sum's greater than the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. And they showed that participation in environmental enhancement and in conservation had an exponential impact on human health and well-being. And the RSPB, the good old RSPB, showed in a Natural Thinking report that kids with attention deficit disorder, with poor self-discipline, and who were basically giving both society and their parents a really bad time, could absolutely be treated better with involvement in the natural world and in conservation than with prescribed drugs or other programs of psychological engagement. And so, increasingly we should be saying to GPs and doctors generally, don't prescribe the medication prescribed the countryside. And of course, with older people who have less ability sometimes to access the natural world, we always used to say that one of the things we wanted to do in marketing the RSPB was to say, join the RSPB and you'll live 10 years longer. Because in fact, that was the case. I mean, it was partly a socio-economic thing, but the reality is probably somewhere in there was a greater contact with the natural world makes you live longer. And indeed, there is now independent research evidence to show that's the case. So what's not to love? And of course, there are wider impacts of a good environment and a good natural environment. I mean, climate change, there are huge contributions to avoiding heat and drought effects, floods, other extreme weather events, and the impact that has also on increased temperature and things like the spread of alien species and new diseases. So there's everything to go for, and indeed studies have shown that green spaces improve air quality and noise quality, particularly in urban areas. They cut pollution by around 25% if you plant trees on them, Woodland Trust. Green spaces help reduce flood risk, and urban green spaces, again with trees, can give a localised cooling effect of 1 or 2 degrees. So why does it not happen? Why is it not happening? It seems to me it's a bit of a no-brainer, so why is it not happening? Well, first of all, there's the whole kind of process. You know, we had a kind of glimmer of hope with the setting up of public health directors lodged in local authorities. Now, I have an aim tonight, and that is to alienate every single interest group in the room. So just keep attentive, wait for the insult that's coming your way. You know, public health directors working embedded in local authorities, the local authorities with the public health budget, health and wellbeing boards, local nature partnerships, all of that coming together, influencing local services, influencing green space management, influencing countryside access, rights of way to improve public health and connect people with nature. That's everything to go for. But it is very patchy. You know, poor public health directors. Have we got any public health directors in the room? I'm thinking of setting up a group called the Society for the Protection of Public Health Directors, because they've really had a pretty tough time. You know, they've been demoted. They're mostly not on executive boards in local authorities. They're, you know, way down the pecking order, and they're having a tough time. But there is a kernel of something in there that's worth going for. And indeed, the public health outcomes framework, you know, we're not allowed to have targets anymore in this government, but you can have outcomes, which look remarkably like targets to me. Public health outcomes framework indicator 1.16 is about the utilisation of green space for exercise and health reasons. And it's going to be measured by Natural England, and they do a thing called the MINI study, monitoring of engagement with the natural environment. But to be honest, you might well cut your throat waiting to see an upsurge, because I think what that study is showing, and it's commissioned jointly by Natural England and the Forestry Commission in DEFRA, and covers rural and urban issues, is that probably what you would have thought about had you not had the data to prove it. First of all, people in deprived communities and black and minority ethnic communities only visit if a green space is very close to their home. And in the case of people in D&E social grades, that means within a mile of their home. In terms of all visit to green spaces, 85% of all visits are within 5 miles, and 60% of all visits are within 2 miles. So the message from that is, if we're going to provide green open space that will help influence health, it's got to be very close to where people live, but otherwise they won't do it. 20% of the most deprived communities never visit a green space. And alas, over the period from 2009 to now, there is no real discernible increase in the number of people visiting green spaces. So whatever it is we're doing, we're not losing, it's not getting worse, but it's not getting any better. So one message for me is accessible local green space. The second message, I think, is the process for driving creation of these safe and accessible local spaces. And that's got to be the planning system. Now, I'm sitting on a select committee in the House of Lords on the future of the built environment, and I'm going to tell you some things we've been discovering from our evidence session. And so the problem is, I'm going to have to kill you all now, because I'm not allowed to tell you till the report's published, and it's not going to be published till March. Oh dear, oops. But the reality is, the planning system is having a tough time. Local authorities are being squeezed in terms of their resources. Planners are thin on the ground. Some of the specialist planners, conservation, biodiversity people, are less in evidence. Planners are heavily driven by the drive to create housing and can spend less time on the creation of local plans and the involvement of people in a much more holistic approach to planning that a local plan well done can represent. There's been a deregulation of planning so that developers can build houses faster. There's been a reduction in the guidance given under the planning system, and though the national planning framework is probably pretty good, it still is very high level and very broad. And to be honest, I think the message coming from government at the moment is the planning system is there only to do two things. One is drive economic development, and the second is to make sure that there's houses for people so that they can play their role in economic development. So George Osborne is the chief planner of this country, which I hope gives you a lot of confidence. We've also, in the process, lost a focus on design standards and design standard review. There used to be some quite good processes in place to make sure that plans and individual developments were well designed to think about urban green space, rural green space, to think about economic and environmental sustainability working hand in hand. Most of that has got lost in both the squeezes and the deregulation. And though there are some good examples, there are many where it's stack 'em high and sell 'em cheap that's going at the moment. I think the one thing that's been of beneficial impact in the last few years is that urban development is actually improving in terms of green space and the environment. You know, we're getting a lot more sustainable urban drainage, we're getting a lot more permeability of landscapes that people within cities can walk through. There's a real emphasis on trying to reduce the car dependency culture. So there have been some good developments, but we're very far away from a process where both the users of development, the promoters of development, and the local authorities are working together to produce the best environments that they can as a result of the planning process. Of course, there are many people producing local, accessible green spaces for people to visit. I should, of course, praise the Woodland Trust in that, but the Wildlife Trusts are also doing it in some of their urban areas. But it is very much, if we're thinking about how do we get at the maximum number of people with good accessible urban spaces, it's very much going to be an urban issue and not a rural issue. The third thing that I think is a challenge that we need to connect with is the whole business of culture. For many black and minority ethnic communities, the idea of a walk in the wood or the walk in the park is just so culturally divorced from anything that they've ever experienced before in this country. Many of them come from perhaps rural environments where in their original settings, but they've been urban people ever since their families first arrived here, and they may be second and third generation. And there is no real kind... I mean, I look around tonight and we're pretty white, I have to say. And we need to make sure that we're finding ways in which we can get black and minority communities comfortable with accessing green open space and taking activity and exercise. I did a heartbreaking study with Bengali ladies in the East End who, in the whole of a 24-hour period, if you're a Bengali lady, what you want is a daughter-in-law, because then you can stop working. She does all the work. You sit back. She makes you nice cakes. You eat them. And the amount of activity, and activity was defined as standing up and not sitting down, for my Bengali ladies, who I loved to bits, was 40 minutes in the whole of a 24-hour period. You know, and then they wondered why they got really fat and ill. And there was no ability to have a dialogue with the men in their communities who didn't like the women going out on their own. So if you had any proposition to get more active women, you had to sort the men out as well. And we've got to be alert to that. You know, we cannot leave a huge proportion of our urban populations not getting the benefits of access to green open space. So I led a walk round the North Circular by the women of the Neasden Sikh temple. And they were great. I mean, some of them, I don't think had walked the length of themselves forever. So we had to stop a lot. But we had 10,000 Sikh women walking one Sunday. And it was just tremendous. And it was liberating for them because they know how to do it now. They know how to go out and have a walk. And it was great. And the kids were with us and it was just tremendous. But there's got to be a real focus on the black minority ethnic community. The fourth thing is the kids. You know, what have we done to kids? We've sold off their playing fields. We let them sit in front of computer screens. We sell hideous food to them. You know, we're now at a point where not only is 1 in 5 kids overweight when they go into school, but that twice as many of them are overweight when they come out of school. I mean, this should be the other way around in my book. So we've really got to work through this conundrum of how we get kids who are, after all, in a very influenceable setting. You know, there's an organisation that if they say they're going out walking, they bloody well go out and walk. It's called a school. And so we've got to get to the point where we're really getting schools engaged with school grounds, school food production in grounds, engaging kids with watching wildlife, and getting the little buggers out of the school run and walking to school. How are we going to persuade the government this is important? Well, you could say what we do is stress the economic benefits. There have been a number of reports, and not the least the most recent report from the Natural Capital Committee on the economic benefits of wildlife and green space and access to green space. And they focus on things like, you know, reduced healthcare costs and enhanced value of properties built with trees or close to green spaces, or the cheapness of managing urban environments that are planted to trees rather than planted to grass or hard surfaces. All of those sorts of things. And we can make the economic case until we're blue in the face. But for me, it's not going to be won by the economic argument. It's going to have to be won by the health arguments and by the hearts and minds argument. One last caution, and that is, I've talked a lot about green space. And I think if you look at the report that the Wildlife Trust did on, I can't remember what it's called, recently, the Wildlife Trust and RSPB, on trying to get the government to write a plan for biodiversity in anticipation of the government's new, whatever it's going to be. Every time I talk to the ministry, he calls it something different. 25-year environment strategy, 25-year biodiversity strategy. The reality is, I think that biodiversity protection and access to green space in the interests of health are two linked but quite separate things. Because if we are going to encourage people to visit green space, to exercise in green space, to care for green space, to get interested in the common birds, animals and plants of green space, it's got to be close to them. And that's the big, strong message that comes out of the research. And so there are other places, special places that are good for key habitats, key species. They've also got to be looked after, but they're not necessarily one and the same place as the places that are going to promote health in the average urban and urban fringe population, which is the vast majority of people in this country. And we need to remember that. So we need to start promoting some of the standards that are about accessibility and health in green space, as well as the biodiversity standards and the landscape standards that we've been promoting in the past. So I'm going to leave it there. It's all terribly difficult. Don't hold your breath and wait for the government, because you'll be there looking blue in the face for a very long time. It seems to me that the only people with real power in this country at the moment are local people, local authorities, local planners, local nature partnerships, local environment partnerships, people. And so go and fix it.